Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another gentle walk through the quieter corners of history. As the world around you slows down and the night deepens, I invite you to rest, to loosen the day's weight, and to drift with me into a story from long ago. Perhaps you are lying down in bed, a soft blanket around you, or maybe listening in a favorite chair as the lamps dim. Wherever you are, let the stillness of this moment hold you, and let us journey together. Tonight, our path takes us to the Middle Ages, a time of castles and cathedrals, of markets buzzing with traders, of knights marching beneath banners, and of peasants tilling the earth. When we imagine this world, we often think of noble feasts, long wooden tables piled with roasted meats, sweet pastries, steaming soups, and flagons of ale raised in laughter. It is a romantic image, one that storytellers and films have painted again and again. But beneath the glow of torchlight and the cheer of music, there was another truth. Food, the very thing meant to sustain life, could also bring pain, weakness, and even death. The Middle Ages were not a time of supermarkets and balanced diets. They were a time when people ate what was near, what was cheap, and what was preserved by salt, smoke, or ferment. It was a time when bread might stretch with ground bark or powdered chalk, when wine soured quickly, and when meats were left too long in smoky corners before being served. Food was not always nourishment, it could be poison. And the same delicacies that nobles displayed with pride often carried hidden dangers. As we drift through tonight's story, we will uncover how the medieval world dined, how its indulgences weakened bodies, and how its so-called luxuries might well have killed those who consumed them. It is a tale of irony, how the rich, in their pursuit of pleasure, sometimes hastened their decline, and how the poor, with their scraps and thin soups, often bore the heavier burden of malnutrition. It is a reminder that history's banquets were not as golden as they appeared. Picture now a medieval street at dusk. The air is cool, touched by the smoke of hearths burning wood and peat. Stone houses lean close together, their wooden beams creaking as the night wind sighs. From open shutters drifts the smell of food, stews bubbling in iron pots, bread baking in stone ovens, herbs drying in small bundles above fires. Children dart through narrow alleys, their laughter fading as they are called inside. Merchants close their stalls, covering baskets of fish or pulling cloth across wheels of cheese. And above it all, in a manor on the hill or within the walls of a castle, servants carry trays into vast halls, where candles throw long shadows across carved beams and banners. Here, in these halls, feasts were held to show power and wealth. Tables groaned beneath spiced meats, pies, and golden goblets of wine. But what the candlelight could not reveal were the risks: salted fish that had spoiled in transit, bread baked with poor flour cut by dishonest millers, wine sweetened with lead to hide its sourness. Guests cheered, musicians played, and toasts were raised, but beneath the splendor lay silent dangers. This is the world we enter tonight. A world where food was not guaranteed to heal or strengthen, but could betray those who trusted it. A world where hunger pushed peasants toward whatever could be eaten, and where nobles, blind to moderation, indulged in ways that burdened their own bodies. It is a journey into irony, into fragility, into the hidden side of medieval life. So, as you rest, let us walk together into the past. Let the quiet streets of the medieval town unfold around you. Let the glow of torches flicker against stone walls, and the distant sound of a feast echo faintly across the night. We will listen not to the music, but to the silence between, to the whispers of history that remind us that even something as ordinary as food carried both comfort and danger. And with that, our journey begins. If you close your eyes now, you might picture the wide open fields of medieval Europe, a patchwork of greens and gold stretching as far as the horizon. Farmers bent low over the earth, their hands caked in soil, coaxing food from ground that was never truly generous. Grain was the staple: barley, rye, and oats, heavy loaves baked in stone ovens, coarse and filling but often sour with age. Yet beyond these fields, in the markets of towns and cities, other foods began to appear. Exotic things carried by merchants, shining in their strangeness, promising flavor, wealth, and novelty. These were the seeds of change, and with them came risks no one yet understood. In the ports along the North Sea and the Mediterranean, ships creaked against wooden piers. Their sails sagged, their holds filled with goods from faraway lands. Barrels of salted fish from the Baltic, sacks of spices from the Levant, wines from France and Italy, and even sugar in its raw, crystalline form. Sugar, once rare, so rare that kings counted it among their treasures, was slowly slipping into wider trade. And with sugar came new desires, cravings that would spread like fire through society. What began as a sweet treat for the wealthy would, in time, reveal its shadow. Picture, for a moment, a merchant standing in a crowded market square in London. The year might be the late 1300s. Around him rise timber-framed houses, their upper stories leaning toward one another as though whispering secrets. The air smells of smoke from hearth fires and of animals penned nearby. He has set out his wares, candied fruits, sacks of spices, small cones of sugar. Around him gather curious customers, ladies in heavy gowns, servants sent by noble households, even a few townsfolk daring to spend a week's wages on something extraordinary. Their eyes widen at the taste, their tongues shocked by sweetness. The merchant smiles, knowing he has planted a new hunger. At the same time, far from the markets, in the quiet kitchens of monasteries and noble houses, cooks experimented. They ground flour too coarse to be fine, but they mixed it with honey or sugar to mask the bitterness. They fried dough in lard, made pastries dense with spice, or sweetened wines until they became syrupy. These were luxuries, indulgences reserved for those who could afford them. Yet every bite carried dangers unseen, contamination, spoiled fats, parasites hiding in poorly cooked meats. What tasted of delight often carried illness. Consider a simple soldier, returning from campaign. His boots are caked with mud, his body weary from months of marching. In a village tavern, he spends his coin on what is called food but would barely pass by our standards. A slab of bread, tough as wood. A piece of salted pork, almost too hard to chew. And yet, in the corner of the tavern, he notices something different, fried pastries dusted with sugar, brought in by a traveling cook. For a moment, the soldier feels lifted, something new, something sweet, a promise of pleasure after hardship. He cannot know that the oil used for frying was rancid, that the sweetness hides rot. What he eats warms him tonight, but it sows sickness for the morning. In fields again, the farmer toils, not with sugar but with what the land yields. His children chew coarse bread until their jaws ache. To sweeten it, he drizzles a drop of honey, precious and rare. He hears stories of nobles feasting on candied almonds, of kings savoring syrup poured over roasted meat. He wonders if such flavors might ever find their way to his humble table. But he cannot see how this craving will grow into a force greater than armies, reshaping not only diets but economies, health, and the very rhythms of life. The seeds of change were scattered in many ways, through trade routes stretching across seas, through kitchens where cooks sought novelty, through soldiers and travelers who brought back new tastes. They promised comfort, delight, and luxury. But beneath the sweetness lay danger. Sugar rotted teeth. Spoiled meats carried illness. Fried doughs and heavy fats burdened bodies already strained by labor. It was not just food, it was the beginning of what we might call medieval junk food. Yet in that moment, in those early years, no one thought of danger. They thought only of pleasure, of novelty, of the joy of tasting something rare. Just as a flower admired for its beauty may conceal poison within its petals, so too did these foods carry shadows unseen. The farmer, the merchant, the cook, the soldier, they were the first to touch these seeds of change. And though they could not know it, the roots of suffering were already beginning to grow. And so, the story moves forward. The seeds planted in fields, kitchens, and markets will soon bloom into indulgence. The halls of power, the feasts of nobles, the smoky taverns of towns, all will taste this sweetness, and all will pay its price. If you step away from the muddy fields and crowded markets for a moment, the air begins to change. The noise of hawkers fades, the smell of livestock and hearth smoke drifts behind you. Now, imagine entering the great halls of the powerful, where heavy wooden doors swing open to reveal a world entirely apart from the lives of ordinary people. Here, in palaces, guild halls, and the private chambers of the wealthy, food was not only nourishment, it was a statement of status, a performance of power, and, often, a hidden danger dressed in splendor. Picture a banquet hall in a medieval castle. The ceiling is high, supported by beams darkened with smoke from decades of fire. Tapestries line the walls, their threads shimmering faintly in the torchlight, telling stories of battles and hunts. Long oak tables stretch the length of the hall, groaning beneath platters of roasted meats, pies with thick golden crusts, flagons of ale, and goblets filled with spiced wine. Musicians play softly in the background while noblemen laugh, their jeweled rings flashing as they raise their cups. To the eye, it is abundance, to the heart, it is a display of wealth. Yet the food itself, so rich, so poorly preserved, was often as dangerous as it was impressive. A lord seated at the head of the table tears into a roasted swan, its feathers carefully arranged around the dish for spectacle. Beside him, a lady dips candied almonds into honey so thick it clings to her lips. Their laughter fills the room, but what they do not notice is that the meats have been salted for months, sometimes years, before reaching the table. The spices, costly as gold, mask the taste of rot. Each mouthful, though delicious to them, carries invisible risks, parasites, spoiled fats, illnesses waiting to spread. Luxury had its shadows, though the guests chose not to see them. Step now into the guild halls of wealthy merchants. These were not kings or dukes, but men whose wealth came from trade, from ships that sailed across dangerous seas. In their halls, the feasts were just as lavish, perhaps even more ostentatious. Gold plates gleamed beneath candlelight, silver goblets overflowed with wine sweetened by sugar imported from the East. Here, sugar was not only food, it was a badge of success. To offer a guest candied fruits or spiced cakes was to say, I have wealth enough to buy the rarest of luxuries. And yet, the sugar that sparkled so brightly on the table carried consequences that none of them could imagine, rotting teeth, sickness of the body, and cravings that would spread like fire through every class of society. Beyond the guild halls and castles, even in taverns favored by lesser officials and traveling clerks, indulgence seeped in. In smoky rooms where the ceiling was low and the air heavy with the smell of ale, men gambled with dice while platters of fried dough and spiced sausages were passed from hand to hand. These foods were not fresh, not clean, but fried in reused oils that turned bitter with each use. The tavern keepers knew their customers wanted flavor, not safety, and so they gave it to them in abundance. Each bite filled bellies and lifted spirits, but it also planted seeds of sickness that no one could yet trace. Now imagine the kitchen behind the banquet, where servants toiled unseen. The fires roared, great cauldrons bubbled with stews thickened by whatever scraps remained, and cooks wiped sweat from their brows as they prepared dishes too rich for their own stomachs. They tasted only scraps, never the feasts they prepared. And as they labored, they heard the laughter echoing from the hall beyond, the sound of those who lived in indulgence, far removed from the hunger of the villages outside. In this world of luxury, the gap between promise and reality grew sharper. To the elites, the feasts were proof of power. They measured their greatness by how many spices graced their tables, how much sugar sweetened their wine, how rare the animals they consumed. A boar roasted whole, a pie filled with songbirds that fluttered out when cut open, a tower of candied fruits gleaming like jewels, these were not merely foods but symbols, grand performances staged to remind guests of their host's wealth. But for those outside these halls, watching from the streets as carts of food were carried in, the contrast was painful. They saw abundance pass before them, yet their own tables held only hard bread and thin broth. For every lord savoring candied almonds, a peasant child chewed a crust of stale rye. For every merchant pouring sweetened wine, a farmer drank water drawn from a stream clouded with dirt. The divide grew wider, indulgence on one side and deprivation on the other. The haunting truth is that indulgence rarely stays confined. Cravings trickle downward, from palaces to guild halls, from guild halls to taverns, and finally into the homes of ordinary people. What the powerful embraced as luxury, others began to desire, no matter the cost. In time, the foods of the elites, the sugar, the fried doughs, the rich meats, would seep into wider society, bringing their dangers with them. The wealthy feasted with pride, not knowing they were sowing illness not only for themselves but for all who followed. And so, while torches flickered in banquet halls and music played in smoky taverns, a quiet shadow deepened. It was the shadow of indulgence, of wealth flaunted at the cost of health, of craving spreading silently through every layer of society. The castles glowed brightly at night, but beyond their walls, hunger and hardship remained. Luxury was built not only on trade and wealth but also on the silent suffering of those who had little. This was the heart of power in the medieval world, dazzling on the surface, but fragile beneath. A feast that could make a guest's eyes widen in awe could just as easily make his stomach turn in sickness by morning. Yet no one spoke of danger. They only saw wealth, only tasted sweetness. And so the story moves forward, from the shining banquets of the few to the silent tragedies of the many, whose lives would soon reveal the true cost of indulgence. Beyond the glowing banquet halls and the laughter echoing in guild chambers, life in the villages and back alleys of towns told a very different story. Here, food was not an art of performance or a measure of power. It was survival, fragile, uncertain, and easily broken. The same indulgences that the wealthy enjoyed, the sugar, the spices, the fried doughs, the salted meats, filtered down to the poor in distorted forms, more dangerous still. And with them came sorrow that could not be hidden behind tapestries or golden goblets. Let us slow down now, and walk gently through these quieter corners of medieval life. Not the castles, not the grand markets, but the modest homes where families faced the weight of indulgence turned toxic. Each story is small, almost ordinary. Yet in their silence, they reveal the human cost. In a narrow village lane stood a cottage of timber and clay. Its roof sagged under thatch, and smoke from a small hearth curled weakly into the dusk. Inside lived a woman named Agnes, a widow who worked the fields left behind by her late husband. Her life was one of endurance, tilling soil, mending clothes, stretching every crumb to feed her young son, Thomas. One autumn evening, Agnes had managed to trade a day's labor for something rare, a cone of sugar broken into small crystals. To her, it was a gift, a treasure that might bring joy to her child. She sprinkled a few grains into his porridge, smiling as his eyes lit with surprise. He had never tasted such sweetness before. For that moment, the hardship of life seemed lighter. But Thomas grew restless as the night went on. His stomach churned, his body weakened. By morning, he lay pale and feverish. The porridge had been mixed with water drawn from a stream that animals also drank from, and the sugar had masked the foul taste. Agnes held her son through the long hours, whispering prayers, waiting for strength to return. But it did not. When the church bells tolled the next day, Agnes walked behind a small wooden cart carrying her son. Her neighbors lowered their eyes. In a world already fragile, one moment of sweetness had turned into tragedy. The gift of luxury had become the weight of loss. The artisan's empty workshop. Far away in a bustling town, another story unfolded. Here lived a craftsman named Martin, a woodcarver whose hands once shaped crucifixes for churches and fine furniture for guild masters. His workshop smelled of pine shavings and smoke from his oil lamp, the air once filled with the steady rhythm of his tools. But work had slowed. The guilds now favored mass orders of imported goods, and noble households preferred extravagant banquets to patronizing artisans. To earn coin, Martin began selling small carved toys in the marketplace. Children would gather around his stall, laughing as he showed them animals carved from oak and ash. Yet even this was not enough. Tempted by the crowd of merchants and cooks nearby, Martin sometimes spent his few earnings on fried pastries dusted with sugar. They were warm, fragrant, and seemed to lift his weary spirit. But he noticed, over time, that his body weakened. His teeth ached, his stomach burned, his hands trembled when he tried to carve. Slowly, the toys grew fewer, the shapes rougher. One winter morning, a passerby paused at his stall. The toys lay scattered, half-finished, coated with dust. The woodcarver himself was nowhere to be seen. He had fallen ill, his body unable to keep up with years of meager food and indulgence in what little comfort he could buy. His workshop, once filled with the hum of creation, stood silent. The shavings lay undisturbed on the floor, like the remnants of a life carved away too soon. In the countryside, on a strip of land barely wide enough for a plow, lived a farmer named Jacob. His family had worked the soil for generations, coaxing rye and barley from fields that gave little in return. His wife, Greta, kept the hearth burning, while his children gathered wood from the forest. One season, Jacob borrowed coin from a local moneylender to pay for seed. The terms were harsh, but he believed a good harvest would cover the debt. That year, he also tried something new, a suggestion from traveling merchants. He planted not only grain but also a patch of poppies, which could be sold to apothecaries for medicine and even sweet syrups. The harvest was poor. Rain came too late, and the grain shriveled. The poppies bloomed beautifully but fetched little at market, undercut by larger estates. Jacob returned home with nearly empty hands. The moneylender came soon after, his voice cold, his demands heavy. Jacob's debts grew, and with them, despair. In time, the family's meals dwindled to thin broth and hard crusts of bread. Greta sold her weaving to keep them fed, but it was never enough. Their children's eyes grew hollow. The same foods that had promised wealth, the sweet syrups, the exotic goods, had reshaped the market, pushing small farmers into ruin. Jacob sat one night by the hearth, his hands clutching his head, knowing the land that had sustained his family for generations was slipping away. These stories were not isolated. Across towns and villages, homes grew quieter. Mothers buried children. Workshops stood empty. Farms slid into debt. The indulgences of the wealthy had set in motion a hunger for sweetness, for novelty, for luxury. But for the ordinary people, the cost was illness, ruin, and loss. The silence was everywhere, silent hearths where fires had gone cold, silent streets where artisans once called out their trade, silent courtyards where laughter of children no longer echoed. In their place remained grief, heavy as stone. And yet, these tragedies did not stop the banquets, did not silence the music of guild halls, did not dim the chandeliers in noble palaces. The wealthy continued to feast, their tables laden with meats and sweets, while the sorrow outside their walls grew deeper with each passing year. These were the early costs, the human faces of indulgence. Small lives broken by choices far beyond their reach. They remind us that history is not only written in the halls of kings, but in cottages, in workshops, in the fields where families struggled. And as these sorrows deepened, something else began to show itself, not hidden grief, but visible decay. Streets once lively with trade and chatter would soon carry the weight of collapse in plain sight. The human cost would no longer be hidden behind doors and hearths. It would spill out onto the very stones of the city. The streets of medieval towns had once been alive with sound and motion. Merchants calling out the price of their wares, children running between stalls, bakers pulling loaves from smoking ovens, and travelers sharing stories in taverns. But by the time indulgence and hunger had spread their roots, these same streets began to change. What was once filled with chatter and footsteps grew quieter, until silence seemed to press against the very walls. It is evening now. Fog drifts low across the cobblestones, curling around the corners of timber-framed houses. Lamps flicker uncertainly, their oil nearly spent. A faint wind rattles shutters and carries with it the smell of smoke and sickness. Where laughter once rang, there is only the echo of footsteps, slow, weary, unsteady. The city has not fallen in battle, but it feels conquered all the same, subdued by something invisible yet overwhelming. Near a market square, a young man leans against a crumbling wall. His clothes, once neat, hang loosely on his frame. In his hand he clutches a small pastry, fried dough bought cheaply from a tavern, its sweetness long gone stale. His eyes are heavy, his body weak. This is not food for nourishment, it is food for escape, a momentary balm against hunger that only deepens his sickness. Once, he might have worked as an apprentice, carving wood or hammering metal in the workshop of a guild. But now his tools lie forgotten. His wages went to sweetened ale, to fried food too rancid to sustain him. His stomach burns, his body wastes, and he no longer dreams of steady work. Tonight, as the fog thickens, he slides to the ground beneath a shuttered shop. Passers-by glance at him briefly, then turn their eyes away. His life has become part of the city's silence, another shadow among many. In another street, a healer walks with a small lantern swinging gently from her hand. Her cloak is thin against the night air, and her steps are slow with fatigue. She is one of the few who still tries to tend the sick, though she knows her herbs cannot undo what spoiled meats and foul water have caused. She stops beside a doorway where a figure lies curled, shivering. The smell of sickness is unmistakable, sour and heavy in the damp air. She kneels, offering a cup of bitter tea steeped with roots, her voice gentle though she knows it may not help. The figure sips weakly, their eyes closing with gratitude. The healer rises again, her lantern swaying as she continues down the alley. She has walked this way many nights. Each time she finds another body, another shadow. Each time she wonders how many more the streets will claim before anyone truly notices. The city celebrates feasts in its halls, but out here, her lantern flickers over the forgotten. Further along, near the edge of the churchyard, a widow kneels beside a stretcher carried by two neighbors. Upon it lies the still body of her husband, his face pale, his hands folded. He had been a mason once, strong and proud, building walls and arches that still stand tall in the city. But months of poor food and hard labor weakened him. The salted meat he ate to keep working on long days rotted his stomach. The sweetened wine he drank for comfort dulled his strength. Now she walks behind the stretcher, her black veil heavy with tears. The church bell tolls slowly, echoing across the fog-laden streets. Windows remain shuttered, doors do not open. The neighbors carry the stretcher in silence, their footsteps hollow on the stones. The widow whispers prayers, her voice breaking in the night air. Another life gone, another home left empty, another silence added to the city's growing weight. Step back and look at the streets as a whole. Once, they had been arteries of life, connecting markets, churches, workshops, and homes. Now, they are places of collapse. Corpses lie beneath flickering lamps, covered hastily with cloths until morning. Stray dogs sniff at discarded scraps. Shop shutters remain closed, their owners too sick or too poor to trade. The fog rolls in heavier, muffling what little sound remains. The streets tell a story even when no one speaks. They whisper of hunger hidden beneath indulgence, of lives broken quietly in corners, of decay no army needed to bring. The collapse is not dramatic, not a single battle lost. It is daily, ordinary, visible to anyone willing to look, and yet, most turn their eyes away. For the city's leaders, these streets were an inconvenience, a backdrop to wealth displayed in mansions and halls. But for the people, they were unavoidable. Every walk to the well, every journey to the market, meant stepping over the visible remains of decline. The sorrow could no longer be hidden inside homes. It had spilled out into the open, into alleys and squares, into the very stones beneath their feet. And as the lamps dimmed one by one, the fog thickened, and the silence deepened, it became clear, the city was collapsing not with a roar but with a whisper. A whisper that everyone heard but no one wished to claim. This was the new face of suffering, not hidden behind doors, but displayed in public. And while healers and widows carried their lanterns through the night, the rulers sat in their bright halls, counting wealth. The streets lay heavy with grief, yet the empire of indulgence continued. And so we turn next, into the mansions of those who ruled, to see how they looked upon this collapse, not with compassion, but with profit in their eyes. Step away now from the foggy alleys and the silent streets. Beyond them, rising above the narrow lanes, stand the mansions of those who governed, traded, and profited. Their walls are thick, their windows wide, and their gates guarded by iron. From outside, little sound escapes, the misery of the streets does not penetrate their chambers. But inside, the air is warm, the tables heavy with food, and the voices confident, even careless. The great hall of a merchant official glows with firelight. Chandeliers drip with wax from dozens of candles. The table stretches long, covered in velvet cloth, upon which lie roasted meats, sugared fruits, and pitchers of spiced wine. Officials sit shoulder to shoulder, their robes lined with fur, their rings glittering as they lift their goblets. Servants move quietly between them, carrying platters and refilling cups. Laughter rises, echoing against stone walls, drowning out whatever faint noise might seep in from the streets outside. At the far end of the table, an official opens a ledger. The pages are thick with neat columns of ink. Numbers fill the parchment, profits from trade, taxes collected from villages, tariffs on imports. His finger traces the sums, and he nods with satisfaction. The revenues grow, he says. Despite shortages, despite complaints, the coffers fill. The others murmur their agreement. One remarks on the wealth brought by sugar, another on the markets eager for spices. They speak as if discussing a game played upon a board, forgetting that the board is the land itself, and the pieces are lives. No mention is made of the bodies in the alleys, or the silence in workshops, or the widows trailing behind stretchers. Their world is sealed off, insulated by stone walls and the certainty of power. They count revenues as though suffering does not exist. And when it is mentioned, if at all, it becomes only another figure in the ledger, another column to balance. Imagine, for a moment, a young clerk seated near the edge of the hall. He writes as instructed, recording the profits. But his eyes drift toward the window. Through its glass, he can see the faint outline of the street below, cloaked in fog. He knows what lies there, he has passed through it on his way here. He has seen the addicts, the sick, the grieving. His hand hesitates upon the parchment. For a moment, ink pools into a blot. But then his master's voice calls, and he bends back to his task. His conscience whispers, but duty silences it. Elsewhere, in another mansion, a governor reviews a map stretched across a table. Colored pins mark the flow of goods, ships from the Baltic, caravans from the east, grain from the countryside. His advisors point to routes, to taxes, to ways the empire might secure even greater profit. He nods, stroking his beard, pleased with their efficiency. His eyes do not stray to the darkened corners of the map where villages struggle. His vision stretches only as far as wealth can reach. The contrast grows sharper when we remember the voices outside. The healer with her lantern, the widow with her prayers, the addict in the shadows. None of them enter these halls. Their suffering remains invisible, or worse, irrelevant. The rulers see only numbers, not names. Their feasts sparkle with luxury, while just beyond their gates, hunger gnaws at the people. The calm cruelty of it is haunting. Not the cruelty of open violence, but of neglect, of turning away, of choosing not to see. The officials lift their goblets in toast, praising trade routes and revenues. Their laughter rings as if the city thrives. But outside, silence thickens in the fog. The wealth of the few grows brighter precisely because the many fade. And yet, this is how empires endure, for a time. By ignoring the cries of the streets, by insulating themselves with walls and feasts, by convincing themselves that numbers on a page matter more than lives outside. The ruling eye gazes only upon profit, blind to the people whose suffering makes that profit possible. As the banquet continues, music swells in the hall. A servant enters with another platter, a roasted peacock presented with feathers restored, a symbol of wealth and spectacle. The officials applaud, clapping their jeweled hands. For a moment, the hall bursts with cheer. But outside, in the fog, the lamps sputter low. The healer passes another body. The widow kneels at another grave. The two worlds exist side by side, one drenched in light, the other swallowed in shadow. It is here, in this contrast, that the moral void becomes undeniable. Wealth shines brighter when seen against despair, but it is a light hollow at its core. The ruling eye does not weep. It does not even blink. It simply looks past, as if suffering were no more than mist on the horizon. But history is never silent for long. When the ruling eye turns away, other voices rise. Not with armies or wealth, but with compassion, defiance, and quiet resilience. Priests, healers, teachers, widows, small figures who dared to whisper against the silence of empire. And so, as the banquet fades and the ledgers close, we step out again into the night, searching for those faint candles in the darkness, voices of resistance, fragile but enduring. The empire's banquets may have drowned the sound of grief, and the ledgers may have hidden lives behind neat columns of ink, but the streets were never entirely silent. Among the fog, in the narrow alleys, in the corners where power did not look, small voices remained. They were not loud. They carried no armies, no wealth, no decree. But in their gentleness lay defiance, and in their compassion, the memory of what humanity still could be. In a small chapel at the edge of town, the roof leaked when rain fell, and the walls bore cracks that no mason had repaired. The benches were worn smooth by generations of villagers, though fewer came each season. Still, each evening, Father Elias lit a candle at the altar. Its flame was small, a fragile glow in the vastness of shadow, but it burned faithfully. The people who came to him did not come for grandeur. They came with grief. A widow, her veil still damp with tears, knelt in silence. A child stood barefoot, clutching a scrap of bread. A craftsman bowed his head, ashamed of debts he could not pay. Father Elias listened. He did not promise miracles, but he spoke softly, reminding them that their sorrow was not unseen, that even in silence, their lives had worth. The candlelight flickered across their faces, and for a moment, the burden felt lighter. In a world where rulers saw only numbers, his single flame resisted the darkness. Elsewhere, in alleys the officials never walked, a healer named Marin moved with a lantern in hand. Her cloak was patched and her satchel light, filled only with herbs she gathered from fields and forests. She had no wealth, no authority, but she carried what comfort she could. Each night she visited the forgotten, an addict slumped against a wall, a feverish child wrapped in rags, an old man too weak to rise. She knelt beside them, offering bitter teas, poultices for pain, words of kindness. Many she could not save. She knew this. Still, she returned, night after night, her lantern swaying like a star among shadows. For those who opened their eyes in their final moments, hers was often the last face they saw, gentle, patient, unafraid. The empire ignored these lives, but Marin did not. Her care was quiet, her defiance simple, to say with each step that every life mattered, even the ones cast aside. Beyond the city walls, in a village where the fields were thin and the soil reluctant, a teacher gathered children beneath the wide branches of a banyan tree. He had no proper school, only the earth as his floor and the sky as his ceiling. With a stick, he traced letters into the dirt, and the children copied them with small stones. The parents often asked him, "Why teach them? There is no bread in letters, no coin in words." But he smiled gently and answered, "Hunger passes from day to day, but knowledge lasts. Someday, these children may see beyond the hunger we endure." The lessons were fragile, threatened by rain that washed away his writing, by officials who demanded taxes even from the poorest families, by the simple weight of survival. Yet each day, he returned. And each day, the children's eyes shone brighter, their voices rising in unison as they repeated the words he taught. Beneath that tree, hope survived, letter by letter. In a small house at the city's edge lived a widow named Isolde. She had lost her husband to spoiled food, her eldest son to debt, and her youngest to sickness. Alone, she kept a single oil lamp burning each night. Before it, she whispered prayers, not for herself, but for her neighbors, for the sick she had seen carried through the streets, for children whose names she did not know. Some might have called it futile, but those who passed her window felt comfort in the glow. They knew that even if the world had forgotten them, someone remembered. Her prayers wove a thread of humanity through the silence. And though she never spoke against rulers or officials, her very persistence, her refusal to let memory die, was its own quiet rebellion. None of these voices raised banners. None sought to overthrow palaces or topple ledgers. Their defiance was smaller, gentler, yet perhaps more enduring. A candle lit in a crumbling chapel. A lantern swaying in the fog. Letters scratched into dust beneath a tree. A prayer whispered beside an oil lamp. The rulers never noticed these acts. To them, they were invisible, too small to matter. But to those who lived and suffered, they were everything. They reminded the weary that kindness had not vanished, that compassion still breathed, that even in silence, humanity survived. In this way, the voices of resistance endured. Not with trumpets or proclamations, but with steady persistence, like stars in a night sky too vast to be overcome. Yet even with these small lights, the larger world continued to tilt. Wealth flowed upward, into the empire's treasuries. Streets continued to collapse, families to starve. And slowly, the shape of society itself began to change. Markets once filled with artisans grew quieter. Mansions gleamed brighter. Railways and treasuries filled while villages emptied. The imbalance grew visible not only in grief but in the very structure of daily life. And so, from these candles of defiance, we step into the broader picture, unequal streets reshaped by the hunger of empire. The story of the city no longer belonged to individuals alone. By now, the shape of society itself had begun to shift. The divide between wealth and want, once narrow enough to cross with a glance, grew into a canyon. On one side stood mansions glowing with chandeliers, treasuries swelling with coin, and railways promising power and expansion. On the other side lay starving families, ruined artisans, and streets heavy with silence. The empire reshaped itself, but its weight fell unevenly. In the treasuries of the rulers, silver coins piled high. Tax collectors returned from villages with heavy purses, while merchants brought back profits from trade across seas and rivers. Maps spread across tables, marked with new trade routes, each line another thread binding wealth into the empire's grasp. Railways were planned, lines drawn boldly across parchment, promising speed, reach, and control. Inside the counting houses, clerks bent over ledgers, recording revenues with careful strokes of ink. The numbers grew each season. For the rulers, this was proof of prosperity, the triumph of their policies and trade. They spoke of progress, of stability, of order. Yet the ink concealed the cost. Every coin stacked in the treasury was balanced by a life made poorer, every line of profit shadowed by a family's hunger. Step back into the streets, and the contrast sharpens. The artisans' workshops, once vibrant with noise and craft, now stood silent. The weaver's loom sat idle, its threads gathering dust. The blacksmith's forge grew cold, no longer fed with fuel. The woodcarver's stall lay empty, his tools scattered. One by one, the trades that had defined the heartbeat of towns were stilled, crushed by markets flooded with cheaper, mass-produced goods or swept aside by the lure of indulgence. Families starved quietly. In alleys, children shared crusts too hard for their teeth. Mothers cradled infants with eyes too tired to cry. Fathers returned from failed harvests with nothing but silence in their hands. These lives did not appear in ledgers or on maps, but they were the foundation upon which the empire's glowing mansions rose. Imagine now a single market square. On one side, the bustle continues, merchants call out prices, fabrics ripple in the wind, spices perfume the air. To a casual eye, it might look alive, thriving even. But look more closely. In the corner of the square lies a figure covered with a cloth, a body carried there in haste and left until the priest arrives. The crowd walks around it. Some glance briefly, most avert their eyes. Life continues, but death sits silently at its edge. Step further, toward the edge of the district where mansions rise. Their windows glow warmly, music drifting faintly into the night. Inside, officials toast their fortunes, their voices raised in cheer. Just beyond their gates, in alleys cast in shadow, a family huddles against the cold. The mansion blazes with light, the alley fades into darkness. Both belong to the same city, but they might as well be worlds apart. The imbalance was no longer hidden. It was written into the very stones of the city. Streets once filled with artisans now echoed with silence. Markets sparkled with color, yet corpses lay at their edges. Mansions glowed brighter while alleys grew darker. It was not collapse in the form of fire or war, but a slow, haunting stillness, the kind that seeps into every corner, undeniable yet unacknowledged. The empire called it progress. The rulers called it wealth. But those who walked the streets, who buried their loved ones, who carried debts they could never repay, knew another name. They knew it as loss, as despair, as the quiet reshaping of a world that no longer had room for them. And yet, even in this imbalance, time continued to flow. The mansions did not last forever. The treasuries would one day empty. The streets, though broken, carried memory. As night deepened and lamps dimmed, history itself began to whisper. The story we have walked together tonight has not been one of kings alone, nor of battles fought with swords. It has been a quieter story, one written in kitchens, in streets, in cottages and workshops. It is a story of how beauty can become poison, how profit can grow from suffering, and how an empire, for all its wealth, can leave behind only silence. We began with seeds of change, farmers in their fields, merchants in their markets, cooks stirring pots in smoky kitchens. They saw only promise, only novelty, only sweetness. Yet beneath those promises lay danger, hidden but waiting. We stepped into the banquet halls of power, where chandeliers burned bright and nobles raised their goblets in laughter. Their tables groaned with meats, with pastries, with sugared fruits, all symbols of wealth and pride. But each bite carried shadows, each indulgence built upon the hardship of those outside their walls. We walked then into smaller homes, into cottages and workshops. We saw a mother cradle her child who would not wake again. We saw an artisan's tools lie still, his craft abandoned. We saw a farmer weighed down by debt, his family slipping into hunger. These were the human costs, lives broken quietly while feasts carried on above them. The streets themselves changed. Once alive with noise, they grew still. Fog settled over alleys where addicts slumped, where healers carried lanterns, where widows trailed behind stretchers. Silence filled the city not by accident, but by decay seen every day, ignored by those who might have acted. Behind the walls of mansions, officials read ledgers and raised toasts, their eyes on maps and revenues, never on the people outside. Wealth flowed upward, and with it came blindness. Their halls glowed brighter while the streets grew darker, their feasts louder while the alleys fell silent. Yet in the midst of despair, voices remained. A priest lighting his candle in a crumbling chapel. A healer carrying her lantern through alleys. A teacher scratching letters into dust beneath a tree. A widow whispering prayers beside her lamp. These were small acts, fragile as flames, yet they endured. They were quiet defiance, reminders that compassion survives even when silenced. By the end, the imbalance of the empire was etched into stone itself. Mansions blazed with light beside alleys fading into shadow. Markets glittered while corpses lay in their corners. Treasuries filled, railways stretched, and yet families starved. Progress was claimed, but suffering remained. And now, as night deepens, we return to the imagery that has guided us all along. The lamps flicker and fade. The fog settles low across the cobblestones. The sounds of markets and banquets have gone, leaving only stillness. What remains is not noise, not grandeur, but whisper, soft, distant, almost forgotten. It is the whisper of history, reminding us that behind every number lies a name, behind every empire lies a family, behind every silence lies a story. So rest now, dear listener. Let the lamps fade in your mind, let the fog settle, let the whispers of history guide you gently toward sleep. The story of tonight has ended, but its echoes remain, soft, steady, waiting in the quiet. Rest now, for history continues to whisper through the night.